The author Eugene Peterson writes this: "A friend showed me a series of pictures he had taken. The subject matter consisted exclusively of household items found in an ordinary kitchen. A matchstick, a pin, the edge of a knife. Household utensils are not ordinarily thought of as possessing much beauty, but all these photographs of very ordinary objects were quite astonishingly beautiful. The beauty was suddenly visible because the photographs had all been made through a magnifying lens. Small, ugly, insignificant items were blown up to great size, and we could see what we had overlooked in our everyday routine. And it turned out that what we had overlooked was careful, planned details that produce exquisite beauty." This is the third in our series on noticing God. We live in a world that expects answers quickly, that wants the 3 easy steps to transforming your life. I've got bad news. Noticing God takes time and commitment. Surely we've all heard those life stories where the person seems to move from one spiritual encounter to another. Those create a few reactions in most of us. Jealousy, maybe a little cynicism perhaps, and the question, why do dramatic supernatural things never happen to me? There is a prevailing cultural narrative that God is absent. It drip feeds into our psyche. The way to counteract that is rarely the dramatic, spectacular healing or something like that, but perhaps more a steady, bit by bit, step by step process. Though of course, occasionally God does do something dramatic. We quoted the psalm last time that said, "I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence." So this series is about reshaping how we think and recapturing that ancient sense of the closeness of God. Noticing perhaps the wonder of the ordinary and the person who is behind that wonder. This is Dchurched.com. Welcome. One theologian called Diogenes Allen, what a good name, Diogenes Allen, wrote this: "In spite of my religious faith, the ability to preach sermons and to give lectures that were as good or bad as those of the next person, most of the time God seemed remote. Although I had a doctorate in philosophy and theology and had read a lot of books, I did not know what it meant to have an awareness of God in daily life, or how one went about achieving it. How was it that in all my church attendance and advanced education, I had not learned such an elementary matter? My condition would have been easily recognizable by anyone familiar with spiritual theology. My condition is called a desire for God's habitual presence." So what was he saying there? He was saying he'd read the Bible, he'd gone to church, he'd got the degrees, he'd prayed before meals and so on and so forth. But eventually he developed a vague but persistent urge for something more. An urge that so often we find hard to describe. So how do we move from believing in God to encountering God as a lifetime habit? How do we avoid the mistake of the Pharisees from our last podcast, the religious leaders, who failed to notice the kingdom when it was staring them in the face? How do we reprogram our culturally conditioned thinking? How do we adopt a countercultural stance that doesn't give in to secular thinking and instead says that interweaving all things is a presence? Well, the first thing I want to say in this respect is resolve to make a start. Sam Gamgee in Lord of the Rings with earthy wisdom said this: "The journey that's never started will not get finished." We can't control God turning up dramatically or powerfully, but we can develop habits to situate ourselves in openness to his presence. We can begin to notice from God what's already happened in our lives, for example. Perhaps listing moments when prayer was answered, and then making another list of the good things you have going on in your life just now, from the small to the large. Now, the instinct will be just to dismiss these things as ordinary, a bit like those utensils that we mentioned at the beginning, just something very, very ordinary. Each thing might be explainable, for example, through a lens of scientific rationalism. But what I want to say is put aside those very valid questions for a while. Make a list. Talk to God about the list. Sometimes it's just the cumulative effect of multiple ordinary things being noticed that causes the lights to go on and our hearts to be warmed. Dallas Willard said this about being a disciple of Jesus. The disciple is one who, intent upon becoming Christlike, systematically and progressively rearranges his affairs to that end. We cannot wait to be zapped. We cannot just sit passively hoping. Our job is to do our part, to nurture habits of noticing, to nurture habits of placing our bodies where we might be able to hear the still small voice. In short, to begin doing what we can and to trust divine love for the rest. So there is intentionality and there is self-discipline. But of course, we can't treat it just like a simple recipe, just do enough spiritual practices and God will turn up. There are lots of techniques and practices, of course, such as the examine or the use of stillness or countless other things. I have a book on my shelf that has over 50 of these things. The end goal is not that we get more disciplined using different techniques. The goal is that we find personal ways to develop an acute antenna. These things are like tools in the toolbox to enable us to notice the presence of God. But we have to develop an antenna to pick up God's presence, and very occasionally God's startling presence. Willpower, of course, isn't enough. And to be honest, no amount of spiritual disciplines can force God to respond like a vending machine, put the money in and you get whatever it is that comes out. The Pharisees tithed, they fasted, they prayed. They were probably very often good people. But they failed to notice the presence of the King when Jesus was there in front of them. So that's a warning to all of us. But there are things we can do and are called to do. So first thing, make a start. Do something. Reflect on it as you go along. But stick with it for a while. Faithfulness is important, and maybe that just means sticking at it. Maybe God wants to know that at a certain time or place, you will always pause to acknowledge his presence. I like to do it at traffic lights sometimes. It teaches me not to be impatient. Keep your eyes open, but acknowledge the one who is close. So make a start. Learn to hear the quiet voice of love. Develop discernment. Amongst all the challenges of this journey is to discern God's voice in the midst of all the other voices. There are voices from our culture. There are voices from our past. There are voices of our own desires. There are voices maybe of significant others in your family, or maybe voices from your work culture. The static and noise in our heads can be quite deafening. So it takes a lot of practice to silence those other voices and to be present to the one who calls himself Yahweh. And I'm still learning that journey. One way I like to do this is sometimes lying in bed at night or in the morning, I breathe the name of the Lord. Yahweh, Yahweh. I breathe in on the Yah, I breathe out on the way. Some Jewish scholars say that God's name is deliberately a name that you can say without moving your lips. It's a breathing word. Some even argue that we've been doing it all our lives, as easy as breathing. From the moment we are born. That's quite a thought. Mind-blowing. Breathing the name of God. Your entire life then becomes a prayer. Anyway, that's something I've found helpful. Another thing to say is a couple of principles, as it were, to learn as you hear the quiet voice of God. God rarely audibly speaks, very rarely. Whatever you think of it at this point in your journey, God has spoken already and is speaking in so many ways, perhaps through his word, perhaps through the wisdom of others, perhaps through wisdom you've gained yourself, and very occasionally through prompting. but audible voices are normally rare. Secondly, God rarely invades our space or forces his will upon us. He doesn't overpower us, if you like. If I can use the analogy, he's a bit like a gentleman. He allows our freedom and our free will. That means we have to take responsibility to make room for him, but also paradoxically to realize that he's always been close. Creating space and time allows us to notice. It's like that soldier who's been at war coming home early and standing behind his wife who hasn't seen him. He just waits for his wife to turn around and the grand reunion occurs. If you like, our job is to learn how to turn around. The Bible word for turning around is the word metanoia, which is sometimes translated repentance. Let me illustrate this a little bit more. I imagine coming close to a deer in a forest. It requires sensitivity. It requires caution and a quiet attitude. God created us to know him and wishes to be known, but he wants us to learn how to do that. And so he doesn't impose himself on us, and nor is he approached by whacking through the undergrowth with a machete. We don't drive a truck into his presence. It's like going for a gentle walk. Maybe he's playing hide and seek with us, because as we do walk, we learn to track down his presence. We become sensitized to how he works and speaks. I remember walking through a forest in South Korea. I lived there for a few years, and I was thinking there aren't any animals or creatures around. But gradually as I walked, I began to attune myself to the sights and sounds of the wildlife that was there. The point of all this to say that God doesn't pressurize us, but he does make himself noticeable if we train our hearts and our mind's eye to see it. Don't know if you ever saw those magic eye books which had multiple colors in funny patterns on the page, and if you squinted your eyes well enough, you could see a three-dimensional image. Very, very clever. And if you worked hard enough, you could see these images, and maybe for the first time you saw it, you would just taken your breath away by what you saw on the page. So make a start and patiently and quietly practice his presence. So let me conclude this podcast. There's a quote from the book Mariette in Ecstasy. It goes like this: God gives us just enough to seek him, and never fully enough to fully find him. To do more would inhibit our freedom, and our freedom is very dear to God. So what that quote is saying is, he wants us to exercise our freedom to seek him. He's waiting to see if we will. God's not hiding in such a way that we can't find him or that we need a magical incantation to find him. He is closer than we imagine, closer than our next breath. The problem is us. We're called to make a start, to begin to notice. Ecclesiastes says this: he has put eternity in the hearts of humanity. He has put a longing in our hearts for divine love. So let's begin acting on it and enjoying God wherever you are this week. Even if you feel disconnected from others, notice. Dethrone the culture that says God has left the building, and retrain your habits to spot the presence of divine love. Thanks for listening to Dchurched.com. Don't forget to like this podcast and join us on our Facebook page.